The bright fluorescent lights of the bank hummed quietly overhead, casting a sterile glow over the gray carpet. The line stretched almost to the door, and Lily stood at the counter waiting. It wasn't a big deal, just a simple transaction, right? She was used to waiting. But today it felt different. Today the whispers were louder. Lily had a smile on her face, as she always did. It was the kind of smile that lit up the room. Her blonde hair was tucked neatly behind her ears, and her navy blue sweater was a perfect match for her calm demeanor. Most people would call her sweet, innocent, or cheerful. The kind of words you use for someone who doesn't seem to understand much about the world. But Lily understood more than they realized. She stepped forward to the counter when it was her turn. The teller, a young woman with tight black curls, and a name tag that read Sandra, barely looked up. Lily's fingers fumbled with the paper, and her heart thudded a little louder in her chest. She hated when people looked at her, like she was a puzzle they couldn't figure out. "Can I help you?" Sandra's voice was polite but flat. Not rude, just distant. Lily smiled again. "Yes, I'd like to deposit these checks." Sandra's eyes flicked over the checks for a moment, longer than necessary, and then she clicked away at the computer, her hands moving fast and efficient, like someone who didn't have a second to waste. Lily's hands tightened around the counter. She hated that feeling of being too slow, of being the reason someone's time was wasted. She had learned to push those thoughts away, but today they crept back in. As Sandra typed away, Lily caught the faint whispering from the people behind her in line. "She's taking forever. Is she even going to get it right? They should have someone else help her." The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. A flush rose on Lily's neck, but she stayed still. She knew what was coming. She had seen this before. People's faces harden when they thought she wasn't paying attention. They would wait, impatiently, as she struggled to navigate a world that often didn't make room for her. And if she made a mistake, even a small one, it would be magnified, scrutinized. But Lily wasn't looking at the others. She was focused on Sandra, focused on the dull clicking of the keyboard, on the fact that Sandra didn't even seem to notice the way Lily's hands were shaking, or the way she was trying so hard to get it right. All she could hear was the soft noise of keys tapping, 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 until, "Excuse me," a voice rang out clear and steady, cutting through the tension. Lily's eyes flicked toward the source of the voice. It was Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise's sudden appearance seemed almost unreal. It wasn't just that he was a celebrity. No, it was more than that. It was the way he stepped into the scene, with an air of quiet confidence that immediately made the room shift. People paused mid-conversation. Some turned their heads. A few even gasped, blinking as if they weren't sure they had seen what they thought they had. Lily blinked too. At first, she didn't fully process what was happening. She had heard the whispers behind her, had felt the sting of judgment. But now, there was something else in the air. A momentary distraction, a blip of something larger than herself. She stared at Tom. The famous actor stood near the front, his gaze casually scanning the room, unaware of the silent tension that had suddenly been wrapped around her. But to Lily, it felt like all eyes were on him, and none of them were on her. She shifted uncomfortably on her feet, her mind racing with questions. Why is he here? Why today? She felt the heat creeping up her neck again, the same way it had done when people had whispered about her. Her palms were clammy. She could feel her heartbeat quicken, but she forced herself to breathe. "Here you go," Sandra finally said, pushing a slip of paper toward Lily. Lily reached for it, but as her hand closed around the paper, she accidentally brushed against Sandra's fingers. It was a brief touch, barely noticeable, but it sent a jolt of discomfort through Lily. Sandra's fingers recoiled for a split second, and for a heartbeat, the teller's eyes flicked to her with a coldness that stung, before quickly returning to the computer screen. Lily lowered her gaze to the counter, her fingers tightening around the paper. Did I do something wrong again? She hated the way the feeling of being wrong seemed to hang over her, like a shadow that no matter how far she walked, it would always follow. Behind her, someone cleared their throat, loud enough to be noticed but not enough to be outright rude. Lily's stomach twisted. She didn't look behind her. She couldn't. She just kept her head down, focusing on the paper, trying to ignore the growing feeling in her chest that told her something was off. She had been in enough situations like this before. She could feel the buildup. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. It was the heavy silence. A moment of stillness. And then another. Sandra continued typing away, now entirely ignoring Lily, lost in her own task. The sound of the keyboard click-clack, filled the space almost too loud. Lily clenched her fists at her sides. She didn't understand what had gone wrong. She wasn't stupid. She wasn't slow. But why did it feel like everyone in the room was judging her? Lily forced herself to focus, trying to block out the nagging sense that she was the cause of the unease. She should have been faster, shouldn't have let herself get so flustered, but the pressure was rising, building, until it felt like there was no way out. The sense of being a burden, an inconvenience, was too heavy. She exhaled, letting her shoulders drop. It'll be over soon, she told herself. Just stay calm. But then another sound, footsteps. They were approaching. Closer. Lily turned just slightly, catching sight of a man walking toward her. It was Tom Cruise again, his gaze sweeping across the room, and his movements were slow but deliberate. His presence seemed to draw every eye. It wasn't just that he was famous. There was something magnetic about the way he moved, the way he made space for himself without even trying. And then with a slow, steady breath, he stopped in front of Lily. Sandra, finally noticing the new arrival, stopped typing and froze. For a long moment, no one moved, as though the world had paused. Lily's heart pounded, and she felt her chest tighten. What now? Her voice caught in her throat. The pressure, the stares, the whispers. It all came together, a perfect storm, and Lily could feel it rising faster now. Something was about to happen. Something she didn't know how to stop. And then the worst thing she could imagine happened. It wasn't just the moment she feared, but 1,000 tiny cuts, sharp and quick. The tension in the bank was palpable now. Lily's heart hammered in her chest, each beat syncing with the quiet buzzing of the fluorescent lights above her. Tom Cruise was still standing near the front, casually observing the scene around him, while the world seemed to stop around Lily. The small movement of his head as he scanned the room felt like a spotlight on her, though he wasn't even looking directly at her. Sandra's fingers tapped restlessly against the keyboard, but this time, her eyes kept darting to Lily's paperwork. She looked up at Lily with an impatient frown, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You didn't fill out this part of the deposit slip," Sandra said, her tone a little sharper than it had been before. Lily blinked. She hadn't noticed the error. In her nervousness, she had missed one small detail. Her throat tightened. "I'm sorry," she whispered, quickly pulling the slip back toward her. She felt the eyes of the people behind her, boring into her back. Their glances were sharp and full of judgment, and it made her feel small, invisible, but not in the way she wanted. It was as if she was in the way, an obstacle to be ignored. The heat crawled up her neck again, her cheeks burning. "You really should pay more attention," Sandra said, her voice barely concealing her irritation. "This is the third time this week we've had people coming in without filling out their slips properly." Lily's breath caught in her throat. Third time. It was as though she had already been counted as another failure, another problem. Her hands trembled as she tried to fill out the form correctly, her fingers fumbling with the pen. Behind her a murmur spread. "She's always so slow. Maybe she shouldn't be here alone." Lily tried to focus, but it was impossible. Her palms were sweating, and her mind raced. The whispers had started up again, more distinct now, louder than before. It wasn't just the whispers now either. It was the stares, the glances of disapproval. She could feel them boring into her, making her feel smaller with each passing second. She could almost hear their thoughts, echoing in her mind. "She's wasting everyone's time. She shouldn't be here. Why can't she just get it right?" Her stomach churned. Should she leave? Should she just walk away? She could feel the familiar urge to escape rising inside her, an overwhelming pull to avoid the embarrassment, the humiliation. "No, don't leave. Just finish this," she told herself, her inner voice sharp. She had come this far. She wasn't going to run away now. Not again. But then Sandra spoke again, her voice laced with barely veiled frustration. "Honestly, Lily, it's not that hard," Sandra said, loud enough for the people behind her to hear. "It's just a deposit slip. You've been coming here for months, and you still can't get it right." Lily's breath hitched. The words felt like a slap across her face, the sting of them sinking deep into her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, trying to will the tears away. Don't cry. Don't make it worse. A woman behind her cleared her throat, and then there was a soft snicker, just loud enough for Lily to hear. She didn't turn to look, but the sound of it reverberated in her chest, pulling her deeper into the pit of shame. They're laughing at me. They're all laughing at me. The whispers escalated. One voice came clearly through the crowd. She's not fit to be doing this by herself. Lily felt her hands go clammy, her mind spinning. Why did I even come today? I should have just stayed home. I should have known this would happen. But she couldn't leave now. Not after everything. Not when she had tried so hard. And then, just when Lily thought she couldn't sink any lower, she heard a voice behind her. A deep, unmistakable voice. Tom Cruise's. Is there a problem here? Lily froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She had never expected him to speak, let alone address her. A woman like her, standing alone in a crowd of strangers. She turned slowly, almost afraid of what she might see. But when she looked at him, her heart sank. Tom Cruise wasn't looking at her with concern or sympathy. No, he wasn't looking at her at all. His gaze was fixed on Sandra, his eyes narrowing slightly, his expression unreadable. The crowd had gone silent again, but there was something in his posture that felt commanding, like he had the power to make the room move, to change the air itself with a single glance. Sandra seemed taken aback, her shoulders stiffening. She didn't respond right away. She glanced at Lily, then back at Tom, unsure of how to proceed. The tension in the room hung thick, like a moment too big to ignore. Lily felt her throat tighten. There was a strange knot in her stomach. Her eyes darted nervously to the people around her, to the ones who had whispered, laughed, and judged her. They were all silent now, watching, waiting. It felt like the whole world was looking at her, judging her every move. She felt exposed. Nothing's wrong, Sandra finally said, though her voice lacked the conviction she had moments ago. She just takes a little longer with these things. Lily could feel Sandra's eyes on her, judging her again, sizing her up as if she was something to be fixed, something that needed to be handled with care. Or maybe discarded altogether. The worst part was Lily felt like she didn't belong. The judgment, the pity. It made her want to crawl into a hole and disappear. But Tom Cruise was still there, standing at the edge of the moment, his presence holding the room in suspense. Lily's hands clenched around the paper again, her breath shallow. She could feel the seconds stretching into eternity. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it any longer, she heard the quiet voice again. I think you're making her uncomfortable, Tom said, finally looking directly at Sandra. Lily blinked. What is happening? The world seemed to tilt. The tension had reached its breaking point. Something was going to snap. Something was about to change, and Lily wasn't sure she was ready for it. But before she could even process what had just happened, the room seemed to hold its breath. And then it came. The next wave of humiliation. Lily felt a cold wave of nausea rush over her, as the whispers continued to circle, growing louder with every second. Her hands were shaking now, no longer just from the pen's tremor, but from the crushing weight of what she had been made to feel. Unworthy, unimportant, incompetent. The pressure, the weight of it all, squeezed the air out of her lungs. She stood there frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. Her heart thundered in her chest, each beat reverberating in her ears. She tried to swallow, but it felt as though her throat had closed up completely. Tom Cruise's words had lingered in the air, but they didn't reach her. They didn't matter. Sandra's dismissive gaze, the sneers of the people around her. It was all that mattered now. The world felt like it was pressing down on her, suffocating her. And then, as though to confirm her worst fears, the voices behind her rose again. Who does she think she is? A man whispered loudly enough for her to hear. She's making us all wait, because she doesn't know how to fill out a form. Maybe she should have stayed home. Another voice chimed in, a woman this time, her tone condescending. I think she needs someone to help her. She clearly can't do it on her own. Lily wanted to shrink into the floor. She wanted to disappear. Why are they doing this? She thought, but the question was futile. It didn't matter. No one cared. She was just in the way, a burden. Her eyes stung with tears, but she forced them back, staring down at the deposit slip in front of her. Get it together, Lily. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of defeat. Every breath felt like a struggle. Her mind was clouded, a storm of self-doubt and humiliation threatening to drown her. She was an obstacle in the way of other people's day, a mistake that no one seemed to have the patience for. And then she heard the most chilling sound, the sound of someone stepping closer. Lily's stomach dropped. She couldn't bring herself to look, but she could feel their eyes on her, all of them. She could feel the heat of their stares as if they were searing her skin. A voice, sharp and brimming with disdain, broke the silence. You're making everyone wait. It was Sandra again. Her words were like daggers. If you don't know how to do this, maybe you should just leave and come back when you've figured it out. You're wasting everyone's time. Lily's world seemed to shatter in that instant. The final blow. She had tried so hard to be good, to prove that she was worth something, that she wasn't just another mistake in the system. But here she was, standing in front of the people who had come to make her feel small, unworthy, invisible. She turned away slightly, trying to hide the tears that were now welling up in her eyes. Her chest tightened, as if there wasn't enough air left in the room. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words were trapped inside her, buried by the crushing weight of humiliation. She was powerless, insignificant. The sting of Sandra's words was like a brand searing itself into her mind. Just leave. You don't belong here. But before she could do anything, she noticed something strange, an odd shift in the atmosphere. The whispers around her had faltered, the tension in the room had thickened, and the once loud murmurs of judgment had turned to confused murmurs. Something was happening, something she couldn't quite grasp. The silence deepened. Lily dared to glance up just slightly, her gaze flicking toward the door. There was no reason to look, no real reason at all. But then she saw him, standing just inside the bank's entrance. A man, tall and confident, with a presence that instantly seemed to command the room. His gaze swept over the crowd, but it was clear he wasn't paying attention to anyone except the people closest to him. His expression was serious, almost protective. Tom Cruise. The suddenness of his appearance was like a jolt of electricity. She could hear the faint gasps around her, and the tension in the room seemed to shift entirely. People's eyes darted toward him, some with awe, others with confusion. The whispers resumed, but now they were different, less focused on Lily, and more on the man who had just walked in. Is that Tom Cruise? Someone asked in a hushed voice. The buzz of speculation spread through the room quickly. It was clear, no one had expected this. Lily blinked, but she couldn't quite make sense of it. Why was he here? What was he doing in the middle of this? Her confusion only deepened as she noticed the way the employees reacted to his presence. Sandra's expression softened immediately, though only slightly. The woman behind the counter, who had been so quick to judge, now seemed uncertain, looking to Tom with an unspoken question in her eyes. The room felt alive now, full of nervous energy. But Lily didn't care. The sensation that had swallowed her just moments ago was now replaced with something new, hope. For the first time, she felt like someone might actually stand up for her. But that feeling was short-lived. Sandra's voice broke through the tension again, her tone tight and defensive. I'm just trying to help the next customer, she said quickly, her eyes flicking to Lily then back to Tom. She seemed flustered. We have procedures here, and I'm just doing my job. Tom's gaze lingered on Sandra for a moment longer than comfortable. His eyes narrowed just slightly, his body standing tall, firm and unwavering. He was still silent. It was like the room was holding its breath. And then finally Tom spoke. Is that what you call helping her? His voice was calm, but it carried an undeniable weight. There was no mistaking the intent in his words. The words seemed to hang in the air, a challenge. Sandra's face twitched in shock, and the eyes of the people in the bank turned back to Lily. But for the first time, it wasn't her they were staring at. The spotlight had shifted. Lily's breath caught in her throat, as her heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Tom was speaking for her. But the question still hung in the air. What would happen next? The bank was deathly silent now, all eyes fixed on Tom Cruise, whose presence seemed to fill every corner of the room. The tension was thick, as if even the air itself was waiting for what would come next. He had spoken, his words calm and measured, and the room waited, holding its collective breath. Sandra was frozen for a moment, her mouth slightly open, unsure of how to respond. Her hands gripped the counter in front of her, knuckles pale, as if she were still processing the unexpected confrontation. A few awkward seconds passed, and the quiet murmur of the other customers felt deafening in comparison. "Excuse me?" Sandra finally said, her voice shaky, her tone too forced to be genuine. She laughed softly, but it was a nervous, high-pitched sound. "What, are you implying that I did something wrong? I'm just trying to do my job here." She quickly shot a glance at the other employees, almost pleading with them to back her up. But none did. Tom didn't flinch. His eyes locked on hers, unwavering calm. The weight of his gaze made Sandra squirm, but she refused to show it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout or get angry. He simply took a step forward, his calm demeanor all the more powerful in contrast to the frantic energy of the room. "What exactly is your job, Sandra?" Tom's words weren't an accusation, but a quiet question. To humiliate someone who's already struggling? Or is it to make people feel small when they need your help the most? The question was like a well-aimed dart, and it hit its mark. Sandra flinched, her forced smile faltering for just a second. She cleared her throat, glancing nervously around the room as if searching for a way out. I wasn't trying to humiliate anyone." She gave an exaggerated, uncomfortable chuckle, trying to shake off the moment. She couldn't even fill out a simple form. It was causing a delay. I was just trying to get through the line." Her eyes flicked to Lily, then back to Tom, as though she expected him to take the side of efficiency over kindness. But Tom didn't waver. His voice remained steady, yet there was an undeniable edge to it, a sense of authority that Sandra couldn't ignore. "You've been standing there, watching someone with Down syndrome struggle to get their paperwork together, and instead of offering assistance, you mocked them. You've made her feel like she's invisible." Sandra's smile now faltered completely. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words stuck in her throat. She tried to recover, to regain control of the situation, but the truth had already been laid bare. Behind her, there was a shift, a subtle but noticeable change. More than one customer was watching now, their expressions no longer indifferent. There was a slow ripple of recognition in the crowd, a quiet rebellion in their gaze. Some of them had already noticed the way Sandra had treated Lily. Some had heard the harsh whispers that had been exchanged when Lily first stepped up to the counter. One by one, the bystanders began to speak up, their voices soft at first, but gaining strength as they found solidarity in what they had witnessed. "That wasn't right," one elderly woman said from the corner, her voice shaky but firm. She was just trying to do what she had to do. A man in a business suit, who had been standing near the entrance, nodded in agreement. Yeah, she didn't deserve to be treated like that. Sandra's face reddened as the voices of support grew. She turned quickly, scanning the room, trying to find a way to control the situation, but it was slipping away from her. The tide was turning. The spotlight had shifted, and this time, it wasn't on her. The bank employees behind the counter exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of how to respond. No one seemed eager to defend Sandra now. They were starting to realize that her behavior had crossed a line that they were not willing to back. Even the teller, who had initially been aloof, was now casting an uncomfortable glance at Sandra, unable to meet her eyes. Tom didn't speak again immediately. Instead, he allowed the words of the crowd to fill the space, each quiet voice adding weight to the growing pressure on Sandra. She stood there, her back straight but her shoulders tense, looking more and more isolated as the room shifted against her. But it was clear. She knew she had lost the moment she saw her own reflection in the eyes of the people around her. She had been caught in the act. Her power had dissolved. The uncomfortable reality of her cruelty was now in full view, for everyone to see. Lily stood still, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt a spark of hope. She wasn't alone in this. The people around her were waking up, and they were seeing what had been done to her. But even more surprising than the outpouring of support was the quiet, steady strength that emanated from Tom Cruise. He hadn't shouted or raged at Sandra. He had simply questioned her calmly and with precision, revealing the truth in a way that no outburst could have. He had given her a chance to redeem herself, but she had failed. Sandra's face twisted in frustration. Her eyes darted from one person to the next, but she couldn't find refuge in their expressions anymore. She had lost. And then Tom took one final step forward. His voice was a quiet but commanding force. "Do you think people deserve to be treated this way, Sandra?" he asked, his eyes locked on hers. "Because I believe that no one should ever feel this small. Not in a place where they're supposed to be treated with respect." The words landed like a final blow, the last shred of Sandra's defense crumbling away. There was nothing left for her to say, no excuse she could offer. The battle was over, and she had lost. Sandra's face turned a deep shade of red, her usual composure evaporating with every passing second. She opened her mouth to speak, to try and salvage what little dignity she had left, but the words died in her throat. I didn't mean it like that," she stammered, the confidence she'd had earlier now replaced by a panic-stricken tone. I was trying to get things done." She was holding up the line, and Her voice trailed off as she realized how hollow her excuses sounded. The more she spoke, the worse it got. The whispers in the crowd were no longer sympathetic. They had turned to murmurs of disbelief. Some customers even shook their heads, unable to look at her without disdain. The weight of the situation crashed down on Sandra. It was no longer about just a customer service issue. It was about decency, respect, and the realization that her behavior had been utterly unacceptable. Her authority, once felt in her curt tone and dismissive attitude, was now shattered in the face of the truth. Tom took a step closer, the calmness in his voice still unwavering. "Sandra, everyone here saw what happened. You tried to belittle someone who was already facing difficulties. And now you're still trying to downplay it." Sandra opened her mouth again, but no words came out. She glanced around at the people watching her, her eyes wide with disbelief. She was suffocating under the weight of their collective judgment. "Do you really think you can brush this off?" Tom's voice was steady, but it carried the finality of someone who had already seen enough. "No, Sandra. It's time to own up. Time to admit that what you did was wrong. Because nothing you say now can change what everyone else has seen." The room held its breath. No one moved, no one spoke. Every eye in the bank was on Sandra, waiting for her to collapse under the pressure. For a long moment, it looked like Sandra might break. Her shoulders slumped slightly, her hands trembling, her carefully constructed facade disintegrating. But then, almost as if trying to salvage whatever shred of authority she had left, she forced out one final excuse, her voice small but desperate. Well, maybe she could have asked for help, instead of just standing there like that. It was pathetic. A last-ditch effort to deflect. But no one bought it. Not anymore. The crowd shifted, and in that moment, Tom's voice rang out, a final undeniable declaration. If you truly cared about helping her, you would have offered help from the start. You didn't. You mocked her. The finality of Tom's words hung in the air, and Sandra seemed to crumble in front of everyone, the mask of authority slipping away completely. She was exposed, naked in her own selfishness. The weight of her actions was too much to bear. For a moment there was silence. Then, as if a floodgate had opened, Lily's face, pale and tired from the emotional strain, shifted. There were tears in her eyes now, but they weren't tears of embarrassment or shame. They were tears of release, of triumph. The customers around them, who had once been mere bystanders, were now showing quiet support. Some nodded, others smiled gently at Lily, giving her silent approval. They had seen the truth, and now, it was clear, Sandra had lost. Her power had crumbled. The world wasn't willing to let her get away with it. Lily's heart was pounding, but it wasn't from fear anymore. She could feel the victory in the air. She could feel the strength of everyone around her, and it washed over her like a wave. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just surviving the world. She was a part of something bigger than herself, a force that wouldn't let injustice stand. As Sandra turned away, her face flushed with humiliation, a few people began to clap. It started softly, but it grew in volume and strength. The applause was for Lily, for her strength, for standing tall despite the cruel treatment she had endured. Tom, Ever the quiet force looked at Lily, his eyes filled with pride. "You were strong," he said simply. But the sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. "You showed them. You showed all of us what it means to hold your head high." Lily's legs felt weak, but it wasn't from the embarrassment anymore. She wasn't ashamed. She was empowered. The moment of humiliation had turned into something far greater, something transformative. She had not just survived this moment, she had won. The weight that had been crushing her was lifted, and she could finally breathe. As she looked around the bank, the people who had been silent spectators just moments ago were now smiling at her. A few even gave her encouraging nods. She wasn't invisible anymore, and no one would ever make her feel small again. Tom stood there, his hands in his pockets, his gaze steady and unwavering as he watched her take a deep breath. For a moment, there was only the sound of the applause, slow and steady, but growing stronger with every second. The world was a different place now, and Lily knew she was different too. She wasn't the quiet, uncertain woman who had walked in that morning, hoping for kindness. She was now someone who had faced cruelty head-on, and come out the other side stronger. And that would never change. The atmosphere in the bank shifted from intense confrontation to quiet tension. As Sandra slunk away from the counter, her face flushed a deep shade of crimson. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. The applause, though soft and still lingering, was replaced by a kind of subdued acknowledgement. Some customers exchanged looks, sharing a collective understanding of what had just happened. Sandra didn't turn around to face anyone. She didn't even bother to collect her things from the desk. Her shoulders were hunched, her posture a stark contrast to the confident, superior stance she'd held moments ago. She had lost. It was clear now. There was no hiding from what had been exposed. Without a word, she left the counter, passing by the group of employees who had stood by in silence. Some avoided her gaze. Others watched her with an unmistakable sense of relief, as though a weight had been lifted from their shoulders too. The manager, who had been standing off to the side, made no move to intervene. It was as if he knew there was nothing left to salvage. Sandra's footsteps echoed in the silent space as she retreated, her exit marked only by the faint sound of her heels clacking against the polished floors. Lily stood there, still processing everything that had happened. The anger and shame that had flooded her chest earlier were now replaced with something else. Something she hadn't been sure she would ever feel again: relief. But it wasn't the sort of relief that washed over her in an instant. It was slow, almost gentle, like a gradual ebbing away of a heavy storm cloud. She could feel the weight of it lifting piece by piece. Tom, ever the quiet presence, stood a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. He hadn't said much after the confrontation, but his steady presence had been a kind of anchor for her throughout the whole ordeal. He didn't need to speak to show her that he had her back. She could see it in the way he watched the scene unfold, calm and resolute. Lily took a deep breath, her body trembling slightly from the mix of emotions she was experiencing. She had stood her ground. She had faced something that had once terrified her, something she had once felt too small to challenge. And she had come out on top. It was hard to believe that it was over. The hum of quiet conversation filled the space around her, as people slowly began to return to their tasks, resuming their business as usual. But it wasn't the same. The air was different now. The energy had shifted, and for the first time, Lily felt like she was a part of it, like she belonged. She turned to Tom, her heart racing a little. I can't believe it," she said softly, her voice shaky. "It really happened. I thought I was going to fall apart." Tom smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. His expression was thoughtful but kind, his eyes reflecting a depth of understanding she had never expected. "You didn't fall apart, Lily. You stood tall. That's what matters. You showed them that you are worth more than they ever thought." Lily looked down at her hands, now trembling from the adrenaline that still buzzed in her veins. The events of the last few minutes had happened so quickly, it was hard to wrap her mind around it. She had been humiliated, then lifted up, then celebrated. And now, Sandra was gone, and the world felt different. But it wasn't just the bank that had changed. She had changed. She could feel it in every part of her. "I don't know if I would have had the courage to do it without you," she admitted quietly, glancing up at him. "You were right there, and I don't know. You made me feel like I could face it. Tom's eyes softened, and he took a step closer. He didn't offer grand words or declarations. Instead, he simply said, I didn't make you feel anything. You had it in you all along. I just helped you see it. Lily blinked, her heart squeezing. She had never thought of it that way. She had always seen herself as someone who needed protection, who needed someone to speak up for her, someone to fight her battles. But Tom was right. She had been the one to stand up. She had found the courage from within herself, even if it had been buried deep. Her mind wandered back to the way Sandra had looked when she realized she was losing control. It had been clear. Sandra had underestimated Lily, just as Lily had underestimated herself. I never thought I could do something like that, Lily murmured, her voice almost to herself now. I've always been well quiet. I never thought I'd have the strength to take someone down like that. Tom chuckled softly. It wasn't about taking someone down. It was about standing up for what's right. That's what made the difference. Lily nodded, taking it in. For a long moment, they stood in quiet acknowledgement, the sounds of the bank fading into the background as she allowed herself to process it all. It wasn't just about Sandra's defeat. It wasn't just about the moment of humiliation. It was about how Lily had reclaimed her dignity, her worth, and her voice. She was no longer someone who had to shrink in the face of injustice. She was someone who could stand tall, who could make a difference. I'm not the same person I was when I walked in here, she said, almost as if to herself. Tom looked at her, a small, approving smile tugging at the corner of his lips. No, you're not. And neither is the world around you. As the final remnants of tension began to dissipate in the bank, Lily realized that this was more than just an isolated moment. It was a turning point. It was a beginning. She wasn't going to let the world treat her like she didn't matter anymore. She had been through too much, learned too much, and now, nothing could take away her strength. She would carry this moment with her, always, as a reminder that she was capable of far more than she ever realized. As the final echoes of Sandra's departure faded, Lily stood in the center of the bank, the weight of the moment slowly settling into her bones. There was a sense of stillness now, an eerie quiet after the storm, as if everything had paused for a brief second to reflect on what had just happened. Lily glanced around at the faces of the remaining customers. Some were still processing, others had returned to their transactions, but there was a subtle shift in the air. No one looked at her the same way they had before. She didn't need to hear the whispers or see the nods of approval. She could feel it: respect. Real respect. She turned back to Tom, his calm presence a stark contrast to the tension that still lingered. He hadn't sought attention or praise. He had simply been there in the moment, offering quiet strength. But Lily knew now that she was the one who had done the heavy lifting. She had found her courage, and that was a feeling she would carry with her for the rest of her life. I can't thank you enough, Tom, she said, her voice thick with emotion. But I think you're right. It wasn't just you, it was me. I didn't believe in myself until now. Tom nodded, his expression unchanged but his eyes shining with something deeper. It's always been in you, Lily. All you needed was to see it. Lily smiled, a genuine smile, one that reached her eyes and spread through her chest. She had never felt more alive, more capable. She wasn't the same person who had walked in that door this morning, doubting herself, shrinking from conflict. No, today she had become something new, something stronger. She let out a slow breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking again. I used to think that if I stayed quiet, if I didn't make a scene, everything would be okay. I thought that if I just kept my head down, I could avoid the hurt. But I see now that silence doesn't protect you. It lets the world walk all over you. It lets people think they can treat you however they want. She paused, meeting Tom's gaze, letting her words sink in. Sometimes you have to speak up. Not just for yourself, but for the people who can't. You have to show the world what you're made of, and you have to do it for the right reasons. Not for pride or revenge, but because standing up for yourself is the only way to truly live. Tom's smile widened ever so slightly, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The truth of her words hung in the air between them, a powerful realization that needed no further explanation. Lily turned back to the rest of the bank, taking a long, deep breath. She was ready for whatever came next. She was ready to face the world, knowing she had something inside her that no one could take away. And if she could do it, so could anyone else. As she walked toward the exit, she caught the eye of one of the bank tellers, who offered a brief but sincere nod. Lily returned the gesture, the warmth in her heart unmistakable. She had fought for her dignity, and now it was hers. When she stepped outside, the world felt different. Brighter somehow. Every person she passed, every stranger she saw, was just a reminder that this fight wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had ever felt small, invisible, or overlooked. And so, as she walked into the sunlight, she couldn't help but smile. Today wasn't just a victory. It was a turning point for the future, not just for her, but for anyone who had ever felt like their voice didn't matter. The world may have tried to make her feel small, but now, Lily knew she was bigger than any of it. Bigger than any humiliation or setback. She was strong, and she was ready. As she walked away, one last thought crossed her mind. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stand tall. Never let anyone tell you you're not worth standing up for. It's your turn to stand tall too. No matter where you are in life, no matter the challenges, your voice matters.